The tools have not changed since 1940. Neither has the address. 40 New Salem Street, Wakefield, Massachusetts. A low brick building 12 miles north of Boston. Inside, the same steel dies that stamped balsa wood into airplane wings during the Truman administration are still stamping today. The same family of machines, the same sawdust smell, the same fragile little gliders that a child could buy for a quarter at the drugstore, and still can. Everyone else is gone. Comet of Chicago, gone. Cleveland Model and Supply, gone. Sterling Models of Philadelphia, gone. An entire American industry that once filled toy aisles and hobby shop windows from coast to coast has been erased, brand by brand, decade by decade. Erased so completely that most Americans under 60 have never heard a single one of those names, except one. One company did not just survive the collapse of the American balsa airplane industry. It went shopping in the wreckage. It bought the competitors that couldn't outlast it, absorbed their factories, and kept its own machines running, unbothered, into 100th year. This is not a story about a factory that died. This is the story of the one that didn't, and the question of what it cost the others for it to stay alive. Before there was a company, there was a boy who couldn't stop looking up. Paul K. Guillow was born in 1893 in a small Massachusetts town where the biggest excitement of the week was the arrival of the mail train. But young Paul had a different fascination. Airplanes were still a novelty then, flimsy, dangerous, barely a decade old, and Paul followed every advance in the newspapers the way other boys followed baseball scores. When the United States entered the First World War, Paul enlisted as a Navy aviator. He learned to fly the way the earliest pilots did, by instinct, by nerve, and by a working knowledge of exactly how thin the line was between the sky and the ground. He survived the war. Many of the young men who trained beside him did not. And when Paul came home to Wakefield in 1919, he carried something back with him that no discharge paper could account for. An understanding, deep in his hands and his eyes, of how a wing actually worked. Not the theory of flight, the feel of it. He went on to study at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, one of the finest engineering schools in New England. But engineering credentials were not what would make Paul Guillow's name. It was a toy. In 1926, working out of his family's barn, Paul founded a small company he called New Craft Toys. His first products weren't even airplanes. They were games. The Lindy flying game, a card game capitalizing on America's growing aviation fever. A board game called Crash, the new airplane game. Paul Guillow understood something that most toy makers of his era didn't. Americans weren't just curious about flying machines. They were hungry for them. They wanted to hold a piece of the sky in their hands. Then, in May of 1927, everything changed. Charles Lindbergh took off from a runway on Long Island and, 33.5 hours later, landed outside Paris, the first man to fly the Atlantic alone. Overnight, aviation stopped being a curiosity for hobbyists and became a national obsession. Newspapers couldn't print enough about Lindbergh. Toy stores couldn't stock enough airplane merchandise. And Paul Guillow, sitting in his barn in Wakefield with a head full of aeronautical know-how, was standing at exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. He introduced a line of small static balsa wood model kits, 12 different World War I fighter biplanes, each with a 6-inch wingspan, each selling for 10 cents. 10 cents bought a child a 3-view plan, a bottle of balsa cement, 2 bottles of colored aircraft dope, and a strip of bamboo for the wing struts and landing gear. It wasn't much, but for a dime, it was an entire afternoon of imagination. And for 1927 America, it was exactly enough. The kits sold. Then they sold faster. By 1933, Paul Guillow had outgrown the family barn entirely. He moved his growing operation into a building on Salem Street in Wakefield, the same address, expanded many times over, that the company occupies to this day. The business took on a new name to match its new seriousness. No longer New Craft Toys, but Paul K. Guillow, Incorporated. It would have been easy, at that point, for Paul to see himself as simply lucky, a man who happened to be selling airplane toys the same year Lindbergh became a household name. But Paul Guillow was not interested in riding a single wave. Through the 1930s and into the 1940s, he became something closer to an evangelist for the hobby itself. He authored instructional books, Tom's Book of Flying Models, How to Build Them, teaching a generation of American boys and girls not just how to assemble a kit, but how flight itself actually worked. Lift, drag, the balance of a wing. He was not only selling toys, he was teaching physics with balsa wood and rubber bands, one kitchen table at a time. Then came the Second World War, and with it, a problem no amount of enthusiasm could solve. Balsa wood came from Ecuador, and with German U-boats prowling the Atlantic shipping lanes, the supply nearly vanished. What balsa did make it to American shores was needed for military use, for life rafts, for flotation gear, for the war effort itself. Guillows had to improvise, substituting cardboard and pine wood to keep production alive. The company also found a new, more serious purpose: manufacturing target drone aircraft used to train Army and Navy gunners how to hit a moving target in the sky. By the time the war ended, Paul Guillow had built something far larger than a toy company. He had built an American institution rooted in a single unglamorous building in a small Massachusetts town, a company that had proven through depression and through war that it knew how to endure. He would not live to see how far it would go. In 1951, Paul K. Guillow died. He was 58 years old. But something had already been built that was bigger than one man's lifetime. The tools kept running. The barn was long gone. The company was just getting started. Paul Guillow was gone, but the industry he had helped build was just reaching its peak. And in the years after his death, it would grow into something none of the original hobby pioneers could have imagined. A nationwide obsession, with dozens of companies fighting for a place on the same drugstore shelf. Leadership of Paul K. Guillow, Incorporated, passed to his widow Gertrude. It would have been reasonable for outsiders to assume the company might fade without its founder. Instead, Gertrude Guillow did something remarkable. She modernized it. Under her direction, the company introduced one of the defining products in its history, the Jetfire glider, released in 1953. It was simple, a slide-together balsa toy, no glue required, but it was the first Guillow's product ever packaged by high-speed machinery. That packaging line became, in the words of longtime employees, the heartbeat of the company. It ran constantly. It had to. Demand from chain stores across the country had reached a scale the old hand-packing methods could never keep up with. This was the environment Guillow's now competed in, not a quiet cottage industry, but a crowded, thriving national marketplace. Comet Model Airplane and Supply Company, out of Chicago, had already built a reputation during the Great Depression with its low-priced dime-scale kits, advertised aggressively in model airplane news. Comet had even employed Carl Goldberg, one of the most accomplished model designers in the country, whose competition-winning designs made Comet kits a serious name among builders who took the hobby seriously. Sterling Models, out of Philadelphia, built a reputation for detailed, high-quality scale kits. Cleveland Model and Supply put out plans so respected that builders still refer to Cleveland-style model construction today. For an American child in the 1950s and 1960s, the choice wasn't really Guillow's, or nothing. It was Guillow's or Comet. It was Guillow's or Sterling. Standing in a five and dime or a hobby shop, staring at a wall of boxes with painted fighter planes and gliders on the front, a kid had options, and every company on that wall was fighting to be the one he picked. Guillow's answer to that competition was expansion. The product catalog grew rapidly through the post-war decades. Spitfires, Messerschmitts, Zeros, Piper Cubs, Cessnas, an entire aviation history rendered in balsa and tissue paper, sized for a kitchen table. The stick and tissue construction kits required real patience. A modeler cut each rib and spar from a printed sheet of balsa, pinned the structure over a full-size plan, and covered the finished frame with tissue paper stiffened by dope, a lacquer-like coating that shrank tight as it dried, giving the wing its final, taut skin. A single kit could take 40 hours to complete. One rough landing could destroy all 40 of those hours in a single second. That fragility became, almost accidentally, part of the product's identity and part of its emotional weight. Anyone who built model airplanes as a child remembers the specific heartbreak of watching a wing crumple on its very first flight. Guillow's kept a piece of that heartbreak framed on its office wall for decades. A 1959 letter from a young customer named Robert Higgins, who wrote in blunt, furious, 10-year-old handwriting that his 50-cent Guillow's plane had broken the instant it left the ground, and that he intended to sue the company for fraud unless they improved their lousy wood. It was never meant as praise, but the company kept the letter anyway because it captured something true about the entire industry. These kits mattered enough to make a child that angry. Nobody writes an outraged letter about a toy they don't love. Through the 1960s, leadership at Guillow's shifted again. Alson Earl Smith, who had started at the company decades earlier as a model designer under Paul Guillow himself, took over day-to-day operations after Paul's death, and later passed leadership to his son, known within the industry as Al Smith. The company continued diversifying: jets, spacecraft kits, new advertising campaigns aimed at a new generation of post-war children whose fathers, many of them veterans themselves, understood exactly why a model airplane might mean something. And for a while, it seemed like the market could support all of it. Guillow's, Comet, Sterling, Cleveland, smaller regional players. Dozens of companies filled catalog pages and hobby shop shelves, each certain there was room enough for everyone. None of them yet understood that the ground underneath the entire industry had already begun to shift. There was no single day when the American model kit industry began to die. That is precisely what made it so dangerous. A factory fire, a bankruptcy filing, a company town shutting down overnight. Those are disasters a community can point to, grieve, and remember. What happened to the balsa model industry was quieter than that, and in its own way, crueler. It simply stopped mattering to enough people, 1 year at a time, until an entire category of American childhood had nearly vanished. The first crack came from an unlikely source: plastic. In the years after World War II, injection-molded plastic model kits began appearing on the same shelves as balsa kits, and they solved, almost instantly, every problem that had made balsa building so demanding. No cutting, no pinning parts to a plan, no tissue, no dope, no 40 hours of careful labor that a single bad landing could destroy overnight. A plastic model came out of the box, nearly finished. You assembled it. You didn't build it. For a generation of parents looking to keep a child occupied for an afternoon rather than a month, the choice was obvious. Guillow's felt this shift directly. As plastic kits multiplied through the 1950s and 1960s, the company's own stick and tissue kit business began to decline, even as its founder's original vision of a yearning for flight remained as true as ever. The company adapted by leaning harder into what plastic couldn't easily replicate: inexpensive, ready-to-fly, hand-launched gliders and rubber band-powered toy planes, sold not just through hobby shops, but through drugstores, five and dimes, and eventually big-box retailers. It was a smart pivot. It kept Guillow's alive. But it was also an early signal of something larger, an industry quietly narrowing, company by company, toward whoever could adapt fastest. Not everyone adapted, and the pressure didn't stop with plastic. Through the 1970s and 1980s, a second wave arrived. Television expanded from a novelty into a fixture in nearly every American living room, offering hours of effortless entertainment that no balsa kit could compete with on convenience. Then came video games, arcade cabinets, and eventually home consoles. Entertainment that delivered instant, controllable action, no gluing required. A child in 1985 had entertainment options that a child in 1955 could not have imagined, and very few of those options demanded 40 patient hours and a steady hand. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, a final pressure closed the gap entirely. The rise of ARF, almost ready to fly, models, many manufactured overseas at a fraction of the labor cost of an American stick and tissue kit. Where a traditional balsa kit demanded skill, patience, and tolerance for failure, ARF products promised something the market increasingly wanted instead: speed and near-guaranteed success straight out of the box. None of these pressures alone was fatal. Plastic didn't kill balsa building overnight. Television didn't empty every workbench in America in a single season. But together, compounding year after year, they created something far more dangerous than a single crisis. A slow erosion of the very audience the entire industry depended on. Fewer fathers taught their sons how to true a wing. Fewer hobby shops could justify shelf space for a product that took 40 hours to build and could break in one. The market wasn't collapsing, it was thinning, quietly, continuously, company by company. And one by one, the industry's proudest names began to disappear. Cleveland Model and Supply, whose plans were once considered the gold standard of the hobby, stopped producing new kits by the end of the 1970s. Sterling Models of Philadelphia, a company that had supplied generations of builders with detailed scale kits, printed what would become its final catalog sometime around 1984 or 1985, fading out without any single dramatic closing announcement. There was no press conference, no liquidation sale that made the evening news. The company simply stopped, the way a river stops flowing when its source finally runs dry. By the early 1990s, the landscape that had once supported dozens of competing American balsa kit manufacturers had been reduced to a handful of survivors, and even those survivors were running out of road. Guillow's was one of them. But surviving the erosion was only the first half of the story. What Guillow's did next would set it apart from every other name on that shrinking list. And it had nothing to do with simply outlasting the competition. It had to do with buying it. By 1994, the American balsa model industry had stopped looking like a marketplace. It had started looking like a waiting room. The companies still standing were not competing for growth anymore. There was no growth left to compete for. They were competing for time, waiting to see who would run out of cash, out of interested buyers, out of reasons to keep the presses running first. And in that waiting room, Guillow's made a decision that separated it from every other surviving name in the industry. Instead of simply outlasting its competitors, it began to acquire them. The first move came in 1994, when Guillow's purchased Tiger Incorporated, a Los Angeles company known for promotional flying toys, small foam and balsa gliders imprinted with company names and logos, sold in bulk to businesses for trade shows, giveaways, and advertising campaigns. The historical record on Tiger Incorporated is thin. No detailed company history survives in any widely available archive. What is documented is this. Tiger operated on the opposite coast from Guillow's. Specialized in a product line Guillow's did not yet have deep expertise in, and by the mid-1990s, it was gone from the market as an independent company, folded into Wakefield's operation. The acquisition made a certain cold sense. Guillow's gained access to foam glider manufacturing and an established promotional products business, a growing category since companies large and small still wanted cheap, brandable giveaways for trade shows and conventions. It was not a rescue born of sentiment. It was a calculated absorption of capability the moment the opportunity presented itself. 4 years later, in 1998, Guillow's made a far more significant move. It acquired Comet Industries, by then operating as Comet Industries North Pacific out of Chicago, one of its oldest and most direct competitors in the balsa kit business itself. This was not the purchase of some peripheral promotional novelty line. This was the company that had built its name during the Great Depression on affordable dime-scale kits. This was the company that had once employed Carl Goldberg, one of the most respected model designers in American hobby history. This was the direct rival that generations of American kids had weighed against Guillow's on the same drugstore shelf, deciding which box to bring home with their allowance money. And in 1998, that rivalry ended, not with Comet closing its doors on its own terms, but with its former competitor writing the check. The purchase made Guillow's, almost overnight, one of the largest, quite possibly the largest, toy airplane manufacturers remaining in the United States. It was a milestone that, from the outside, could be framed as a triumph, the last major American company standing in an industry that had claimed nearly everyone else. But framed from Comet's side of the transaction, it read very differently. It was the closing of a company that had survived the Great Depression, survived the Second World War, survived 4 decades of post-war competition, and in the end, could not survive the same slow erosion that had already claimed Cleveland and Sterling before it. There was no dramatic final shift at a Comet factory floor for cameras to capture, no widely reported closing ceremony. What survives instead is a quieter, more fragmented record, assembled from collectors, hobbyist forums, and secondhand accounts passed down within the modeling community, rather than from contemporary news coverage. According to accounts shared among longtime Guillow's builders, some of Comet's original plans and design archives were later lost, reportedly in a fire, though the details of when, where, and exactly what was destroyed remain undocumented in any verified public record. It is a detail worth including carefully, and only with that caveat firmly attached. Unconfirmed, second-hand, but persistent enough within the hobbyist community that it has become part of how Comet's ending is remembered. What is confirmed is simpler, and in its own way just as final. Comet Industries, a name that had meant something to American children for over 60 years, stopped existing as an independent company in 1998. Its assets, and whatever remained of its design legacy, now belong to the company in Wakefield. Guillow's had not just outlived its oldest rival, it had absorbed it. Why does one company survive an industry's collapse by buying the wreckage, while everyone else simply disappears into it? The honest answer has less to do with vision and more to do with position. Guillow's entered the 1990s with something almost none of its competitors still had: a diversified product line that didn't depend entirely on the labor-intensive stick and tissue kits that had made the whole industry vulnerable in the first place. Decades earlier, when plastic models first threatened to make traditional balsa kits obsolete, Guillow's had pivoted hard into simple, inexpensive, ready-to-fly gliders and rubber band-powered toys. The Jetfire and its descendants, sold not just through hobby shops, but through drugstores and mass retailers. That pivot, made under Gertrude Guillow's leadership back in the 1950s, was still paying dividends 40 years later. It meant Guillow's wasn't relying on the same shrinking pool of patient, 40-hour-a-kit hobbyists that Comet and Sterling depended on. It had a broader, steadier revenue base to draw from. That stability gave Guillow's something its dying competitors didn't have in the 1990s: cash, and the standing to act as a buyer instead of a casualty. There is no evidence in the historical record that Guillow's set out with some grand strategy to consolidate the entire industry under one roof. What the record does show is smaller, more human, and in some ways more believable. A company that recognized, purchase by purchase, that acquiring a struggling rival's remaining assets, its molds, its brand recognition, its customer goodwill, was cheaper and more useful than watching those assets simply vanish into liquidation. Buying Tiger, incorporated in 1994, brought foam manufacturing capability and an established promotional products business into the Wakefield operation. Buying Comet in 1998 didn't just remove a competitor from the shelf, it added Comet's brand recognition, its decades of design history, and whatever remained of its production, tooling to a single, consolidated company. It is worth sitting with what this meant for the people on the other side of those transactions. Somewhere in Chicago, in 1998, employees who had spent years, in some cases careers, building Comet kits learned that the company no longer belonged to Comet. There is no detailed public record of layoffs, severance, or what became of Comet's remaining workforce after the sale. That silence is itself worth noting. Unlike the dramatic, well-documented final shifts that mark the closing of larger American factories, the last whistle, the locked gate, the workers walking to their cars for the final time, Comet's ending left almost no trace in the public record at all. No newspaper retrospective, no oral history project. Just a line in a hobbyist newsletter, a paragraph on a fan forum, and a product catalog that quietly stopped being printed under the Comet name. That is, in its own way, a harder kind of ending than a dramatic one. A factory closing with cameras present becomes a story a community can tell for generations. A company that simply gets absorbed, its name folded into somebody else's catalog, risks being forgotten by everyone except the collectors who still hunt for an original, unbuilt Comet box on eBay, men and women now in their 60s and 70s, chasing a piece of cardboard that once meant an entire Saturday afternoon. Guillow's, meanwhile, kept manufacturing. It absorbed the Tiger name into its foam product line. It began, eventually, reissuing certain classic Comet kit designs, a decision the modeling community had speculated about for years before it happened. Evidence that the company understood the emotional value locked inside a brand name, even a dead one, even one it hadn't built itself. By the end of the 1990s, the American balsa model industry, once populated by dozens of competing manufacturers stretching from Chicago to Philadelphia to Los Angeles, had been reduced to essentially one name still standing on its own 2 feet, the one in Wakefield, Massachusetts, that had never stopped running its Depression-era machines, and had just finished eating what was left of everyone who couldn't say the same. Walk into the Guillow's building on Salem Street today, and the first thing you notice isn't what's changed. It's what hasn't. The presses stamping balsa sheets into wing ribs and fuselage formers are, in many cases, the same machines that were running when Harry Truman was president. Depression-era tooling, still doing the job it was built to do, decade after decade, while nearly every comparable machine at nearly every comparable company across the country went silent and cold. The one real technological leap that the company has made in recent years is a laser cutter, a modern tool that does an old job better, giving today's balsa parts a precision the original hand-cut kits never had. But it's an upgrade layered onto tradition, not a replacement for it. Guillow's didn't reinvent itself to survive. It simply kept doing what it had always done, longer than anyone else was willing to. The company's leadership tells the same story of continuity. Tom Barker, who now serves as CEO and treasurer, didn't arrive from some outside industry with a turnaround plan. He arrived from Wakefield High School. In 1975, as a teenager, he walked in looking for a job, and never really left. During the winter months, as a young employee, Barker worked in the drafting room. In the summer, he was out on the factory floor, running every machine in the building, packing gliders, cutting wood, even hauling sawdust out to local pig farms. 51 years later, he's still there. The man now responsible for a business built on the same wood, the same tools, and largely the same product line that greeted him as a teenager half a century ago. That kind of continuity is rare in American manufacturing under any circumstances. It is almost unheard of in an industry that watched every comparable company disappear, and it shapes how the people who work there talk about the place. One longtime employee, when asked why he stayed at Guillow's over the years rather than pursue other opportunities, said simply that he'd once had a chance to go work at a missile manufacturer up the road. Better pay, presumably more prestige. He turned it down. He didn't want to make bombs. He'd rather make toys. The company's relationship with its own history is, in its own understated way, part of the product itself. In the lobby of the Wakefield building hangs a framed letter, the same one referenced decades earlier in company retrospectives, from a disgruntled young customer named Robert Higgins, who wrote in 1959 to complain in blunt and furious terms that his 50-cent Guillow's plane broke the moment it left the ground. He demanded better wood. He threatened to sue for fraud. He signed off, for good measure, with "drop dead." Most companies would have thrown a letter like that away. Guillow's framed it and hung it where visitors could see it, not as an embarrassment, but almost as a badge, proof that for nearly a century, the fragility of a balsa wood airplane has mattered enough to make a child furious, and that the company has never pretended otherwise. As one recent generation of leadership put it, the toys have always been fragile by nature, light enough to fly, and therefore light enough to break. That tension between wonder and heartbreak is, in some sense, the entire product. Financially, Guillow's has never been a giant. Company estimates place annual revenue in the range of $5 to $6 million in recent years, a modest figure by the standards of national toy manufacturing, built on a workforce that has historically numbered only in the dozens rather than the hundreds. This is not a company that dominates through scale. It endures through narrowness, doing one thing in one town for 100 years, while an entire industry around it thinned out to nothing. Ownership itself eventually changed hands in a way that reflects that same philosophy. After 35 years as a family-owned and operated business, Guillow's transitioned to an employee stock ownership plan, not a sale to some outside conglomerate hunting for a legacy brand to strip for parts, but a structure that kept the company's fate in the hands of the people actually building the planes. It was one more decision, consistent with nearly a century of decisions before it, to protect continuity over almost anything else. In the spring of 2026, Guillow's marked its 100th year in business. There was no dramatic turnaround story to tell, because there had never been a near-death moment to turn around from. There was just Salem Street, the same low-brick building, the same machines, the same smell of cut balsa and drying dope, a business that had simply never stopped, while nearly everyone around it did. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over an industry after everyone else is gone. If you'd stood at a hobby shop counter in 1965, choosing between a Guillow's box and a Comet box, you had no way of knowing you were living inside the golden age of something. You just knew you had a quarter, maybe two, and a decision to make about which plane would fill your Saturday. Cleveland, Sterling, Comet, Guillow's, a dozen smaller names besides, all of them competing for the same shelf, the same allowance money, the same restless energy of a kid who wanted, more than anything, to build something that could actually leave the ground. None of it felt fragile at the time. It never does while it's still happening. But it was fragile, more fragile in the end than the balsa wood itself. One by one, the names disappeared. Cleveland stopped printing new plans by the late 1970s. Sterling's final catalog quietly went out sometime around 1984 or 1985, with no announcement, no farewell. Tiger Incorporated vanished into someone else's product line in 1994, leaving behind almost no trace of its own history. And in 1998, Comet, the company that had survived the Great Depression, survived a world war, and outlasted 4 decades of post-war competition, finally ran out of road and was absorbed by the one rival that had somehow found a way to keep going. That rival is still there, still on Salem Street, still running machines old enough to have stamped out wings for children who are now grandparents themselves, still framing an angry letter from 1959 in its lobby, not as a wound, but as proof of how much a 50-cent toy once meant to somebody. It would be easy to call this a triumph, and in some ways it is. 100 years is not a small thing. Neither is being the last name standing in an industry that swallowed everyone else. But triumph isn't quite the whole truth either. Guillow's didn't just survive the extinction of the American balsa model industry, it fed on it. Buying Tiger when Tiger could no longer stand on its own. Buying Comet when Comet's 80-year story finally ran out of ending. Somewhere in that quiet 1998 transaction, in a Chicago office nobody photographed and no newspaper covered, a company that had meant something to generations of American children simply stopped being its own company. Its name lives on now, only inside somebody else's catalog, and inside the memories of collectors who still hunt for an unbuilt Comet box, the way other people hunt for a photograph of somebody they miss. So, what do you call a company that outlives its own era, not by escaping the forces that killed everyone else, but by understanding them better, and by being the one still solvent enough to write the check when the bodies started to fall? Maybe you call it a survivor. Maybe you call it something closer to a keeper of the graveyard, tending machines and memories that belong, in some sense, to companies that no longer exist to claim them. Either way, the presses in Wakefield are still running. Somewhere in that building, a sheet of balsa wood is being stamped into the shape of a wing, the same way it was stamped in 1953, the same way it was stamped the year Paul Guillow died, the same way it will likely be stamped tomorrow. Outside, the American model kit industry that once filled that same wing with 100 competitors is almost entirely gone. But if you drive past 40 New Salem Street on a quiet afternoon and the lights are on inside, they still are.